economía y negocios.
As we mentioned before, today we have an important interview. We will be discussing organizational best practice towards gender equality in science and medicine. Here we are with Dr. Imogen Coe. She is a professor researcher in Toronto Metropolitan University. Dr. Coe, it's a pleasure here to be with you, and it is really an honor. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And this is a very important topic, regardless of where we are in the world. So I'm very happy to have this conversation.
Okay. Also, here we are with Dr. Martin Montero. He's our co-host in this interview. He will do some comments and any questions and some questions indeed for our international guest. Dr. Martin, good evening.
Thanks, Dr. Coe, for being with us tonight, and thanks, Alejandro, for the invitation for being your co-host.
Okay, given that said, we will make a introduction in terms of our international guest. Here we are with Dr. Coe. She completed her Bachelor of Science at the University of Exeter, and then she continued her studies in the University of Victoria for postgraduate studies. She earned a master's degree and PhD in comparative molecular neuroendocrinology. We also are with Dr. Martin. He has a PhD in economics at West Virginia University. His research interests are based on macroeconomic issues and also in developing economies. As introduction, we have to mention that we have addressed 2 interviews before this one. We talk about gender equality as one target and indicator of sustainable development goals, so-called SDGs, and also women's advancement and their leadership. Gender inequality has cultural and economic aspects. Women have made advances in education, labor, and political representation, but inequality is still pervasive. So in this session, we will keep discussing these issues, but with emphasis on organizational best practice towards gender equality in science and medicine. Our interview, as we have other interviews before, is based on a published paper, and now we have one of the author in this conversation. So in order to begin with our conversation, we want to ask our international guest to begin our discussion. Could you explain why gender equality is important? For instance, for example, why is it considered to be a sustainable development goal?
That's a really good question, and it's a very important question, and it's the foundation of why we do this work. So I think from the perspective of being a scientist, which is what I am, I think it's really important to recognize that curiosity and trying to figure out how the world works is something that all humans do. We've been asking questions since humans have been here on the planet, and good ideas and creativity and innovation come from all sorts of people. So from the perspective of getting great ideas in science, driving innovation, driving creativity, we want to make sure that we're not missing out on any human capital. So we can't rule out 50% of the population in terms of contributing, participating, being active, having leadership, helping to set agendas, helping to define priorities. We can't say that 50% of that talent is on the sidelines. We've got to make sure it's involved in the process of science and medicine, and that's really part of society, right? We want healthy societies. We want we want informed societies. Those kinds of societies are better for men and women. So we want to make sure everybody's involved in kind of asking those questions and driving that kind of activity. So I think that's why we want to be striving towards gender equality, because brain power, ideas, creativity is everywhere, and we don't want to be ruling any of it out.
So given that importance of gender equality, we have another question, and this question is related. What are the indicators that women are underrepresented in the fields of science and medicine? And perhaps how should proper balances in their participation are determined?
Yeah, so I mean, I think data are really, really important. We have to look to data and evidence to inform our actions, to inform our policies. And we have a lot of data. It's uneven depending on where we are. So my country, I'm in Canada, we don't actually have great data on who's doing what where. If you look at other countries, they are much more detailed in collecting their data about participation and proportion of women in science and medicine, for instance. We can also look to global data that the UN, UNESCO, the OECD collect data on participation rates. So, for instance, men and women in science and engineering, technology, that kind of thing. So we can look at data locally, and we can also look at global data. And when we look at global data, we can see that there's considerable variation across different jurisdictions. So different countries have very different levels of participation rates. That can be socioeconomic. So we can see that in countries like it's not gender necessarily. It could be like women from rich backgrounds and men from rich backgrounds are the ones going on in science and engineering, and it's actually a socioeconomic kind of issue. So there's a lot of data out there that can tell us that participation rates and engagement and involvement in science and medicine vary around the world, and we can correlate that with sort of cultural and environmental factors. We can correlate that with sort of progressive societies and educational systems, a lot of cultural pieces to that. And we can also look at differences and changes over time. So we can see, for instance, that participation rates in certain disciplines has shifted significantly over time in different ways. And then we can ask questions as to what's going on there and why is that. I think when we consider that talent and ideas and ability are distributed across humanity, so it doesn't really matter what your gender is. There is no math gene, only boys have, that kind of thing. So we know when we start from that understanding and all of the data and evidence support that, then we can look to see that that's not the case. We're not seeing 50% roughly proportion of women in science and medicine, depending on where you are. And ask, why is that? Because it's not that they don't have the ability or they're not interested. So there's got to be something else going on. So the quantitative data are really important. We can also look across career pathways, and we can see that, yes, there are lots of young women interested in the life sciences. But as you go up to leadership positions, you really see a shift in the demographics. So we can see that that there are differences as you go up an organization. And that we can have that kind of quantitative data across a number of different things that we want to look at. There's also the qualitative data, which I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to, which is, okay, there are some places where you might find gender equity, and there are equivalent proportions of men and women in certain kinds of disciplines or certain specialities in medicine. But the qualitative data tell us that they're having very negative experiences, or they're disengaged, or the qualitative experience is very poor. And when people can't be their best, when people can't be productive in a particular environment, then again, we're losing human capital. So there might be lots of women in some disciplines, but they're not having a good experience. And that means that we're not leveraging that talent and that brain power as much as we could. So quantitative and qualitative data are really important. And, we have a fair amount of data. We always need more data. that tell us, yeah, some places there's significant underrepresentation.
Yes, as you mentioned, we have a lot of data. So in your published paper, you mentioned that perhaps organizational climate and culture are two elements that play an important role in achieving gender equality. But what is meant when we speak of organizational climate and culture? What is the role of this aspect?
So I think that can mean different things to different people, and it might mean something different in in the context of economists and experts like you are. I think when we were writing that paper, we were thinking about organizational culture as the culture that the people participating in that organization were experiencing. So it could be everything from processes and policies. How is the hiring happening? How are people being promoted? What is the day-to-day workload like? How are decisions being made? Are people being heard and respected? It's everything from policies and processes to the day-to-day to strategic priorities of an organization. Like, what is the strategic priority of an organization, and does it factor in aspects of equality across a number of intersections? So all of those things go together to create the culture of the organization, and how somebody experiences being in that organization.
When we talk about a culture of the organizations you mentioned, is it related with the culture of the country? For example, is the same that I work in an organization, for example, I don't know, in Iraq, or for example in Japan, or in Germany, or perhaps in UK, for example, or in the US?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think there's any getting away from the fact that organizations and educational institutions, all of us, we sit within our context. So we sit within our within our geographical context. We sit within our political context. We sit within the culture of where it is that the work is taking place. So there's no doubt that the social norms and the expectations and the gender stereotypes and rules and regulations can be highly influential and will be reflected within the organization. And one of the things that I've done is to take a look at some of the quantitative data that the OECD has put out about men and women's participation in STEM careers, and then looked at two countries that are sort of equivalent in size. So I looked at, this is not in my paper, but in other work, I looked at Ireland and I looked at Latvia, which are about the same size, both Northern European, about the same size population. And there's a significant difference in the participation rate of women in STEM pathways in Latvia, much, much higher than Ireland. And so we can't say it's the size of the country. We can't say it's the climate. We can't say it's because where they are in Europe. It's obviously something else is going on, right? And so there are different cultures, different influences, different gender stereotypes that are influencing people's experience in those different places. And so we have to factor that in and possibly look to ways to mitigate some of those biases, or possibly look to leverage some of those maybe less gender stereotyped ways of thinking to make sure that that's an attractive place you want to go. Do you want to go work in a big pharma in Ireland, or do you want to go to Latvia? You want to go to the place where you're going to feel like you're welcomed and you can do your best work. So definitely context is absolutely critical, and we need to be more aware of that, I think.
Okay. Dr. Martin, I don't know if you have any comment or perhaps any question that you want to ask Dr. Coe.
Yeah, sure. I have a question. I agree with Dr. Coe in that ideas, creativity, brain power is everywhere. Okay. And I understand too that in science and medicine, there is an underrepresentation of women. But, in Western countries, it is not forbidden for a woman to go to these fields. So do you think that there is probably some sort of self-selection here. And if that were the case, then why do we want to make things even if women are choosing not to go to those fields?
So I think that's a perfectly fair question. And yes, obviously there is selection going on, but I think one of the questions we want to be asking is what's behind that selection? And I think if you look into a lot of the research, some of the reason that selection is going on relates to, well, I'd like to do it, but to be honest, I'm just not going to put up with the microaggressions. I'm just not going to put up with the toxic culture. So we certainly know, and we can study levels of interest, levels of passion, levels of ability for both boys and girls. So these are the kinds of reports that, again, the OECD will put out for the PISA report every few years. We can look to see how many young men and young women aspire to careers in science, engineering, and medicine. And the last data I saw from about 2015, it's about 35% of both boys and girls. So it's about the same when you ask 15-year-olds. So they both have the same aspiration to go on. And so then we have to say, well, what's happening when we look at the numbers that are actually further along in the pathway, and why are we seeing those shifts, and why do we see boys opt out of other pathways, which maybe they're also very interested in? And is it actually that they're not interested, or they've changed their mind, or is it because they don't see a potential pathway, or they don't see an opportunity for them? And therefore they're not so much choosing, they're just coping. So they're coping with the barriers and the exclusionary behaviors and toxic culture that's in the way. So I think, we can have lots of conversations about should everything be equal. But given that when we look at different countries around the world, and we can see in different cultural contexts that the numbers look different, I don't think it's as simple as saying that they're selecting because they've changed their mind. They're selecting because they see that that's really a toxic place to go, and they don't want to have to deal with that. And we have a lot of data and research to support that as well. So, again, we don't want to be missing out on talent and capital if there is the potential that we can create an environment that people will, I think I actually would like to carry on and do that. And we know, again, from a fair amount of research that is the case.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Coe. You mentioned that perhaps organization have some problems, for example, with stereotypes, with cultural aspects, some kind of bias. So in this sense, what factors are needed within an institution's organizational climate and culture to achieve gender equality?
So you have to look at this from a sort of a multifaceted perspective. So you need a systems thinking approach to all the different levels at which there may need to be interventions, and where there are opportunities for interventions. I think it's really important. So leadership is massively important. So having leaders, whoever they are, men or women, whatever the gender, having leaders who recognize this as being a strategic priority for the organization is critical. Because if you don't have leadership saying this is a strategic priority, this is what we're going to do, then it's very hard to kind of drive the change that you need. So I don't think that anybody should be a leader in an organization if they don't have core competencies in the application of equity principles. So they should know how to apply those principles in an organizational setting. That means that maybe you need to look at your policies. How are you doing your hiring? How are you doing your promotion? What does your board of governors look like, or your board of directors? How are you setting your targets? And how are you kind of representing your organization? These are all things that leaders have to do anyway. They have to have financial acumen. They have to have, some knowledge of human resources, these kinds of things. This is another skill set that all leaders should have. So much of the organizational cultural shift comes from really strong leadership, because you have people who have that skill set. And then it's a combination of things like really making sure your policies and processes are infused with gender equity principles, and most importantly, that those are implemented in a way that there is accountability and consequences if you don't actually follow these gender equity infused processes. Because one of the things that organizations make a lot of make big mistakes around is having grand plans, saying very grand things, saying wonderful things about gender equity, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that, but not actually having clearly actionable specifics that they're going to do, nor holding people accountable, nor having accountability and consequences. So, if you're a middle manager in an organization and you've been tasked with revising your hiring processes so that you get more equitable, fairer hiring, and you don't do it, there needs to be a consequence, right? There needs to be something that says, well, you didn't do what you were tasked to do to achieve our goals. So consequences and accountability are really important. I also think it's really important to set goals, to set metrics, to set KPIs, so that you can assess whether what you're doing is actually working or not. So we're going to do these grand things, but quite often there aren't metrics in place to say, have you achieved them? If not, okay, then we'll tweak it, or we'll pivot, or we'll shift, or we'll iteratively revisit and adjust. So having metrics and targets and KPIs is really important.
Great explanation. We will continue with the topic. We have mentioned that this interview is based on a published paper. It's based on our research. So, for example, in your paper, you mentioned that one important factor is inclusive leadership. So this inclusive leadership could be one driver of organizational change. So, and also you mentioned this is applied to academic science and medicine. But what exactly does inclusive leadership mean? How is it possible to achieve it?
So when I think about inclusive leadership, and we wrote a paper more recently that's in the Healthcare Management Forum journal, inclusive leadership, it really describes a set of skills, a set of core competencies. So it's a set of skills for leadership. People who want to be leaders should have these skills, which speaks to the ability to it speaks to the knowledge, to having a deep knowledge and understanding of equity principles, and the ability to apply them in a leadership setting, in an organizational setting. So inclusive leadership is it's a set of skills that men and women should develop. That it's not necessarily just because you're a woman in science, you're automatically an expert. It's a set of skills and core competences that involve, knowing the vocabulary. Can you speak to what it means to talk about gender equity, or to talk about intersectional approaches to doing something? Can you talk about the challenges associated with microaggressions in the workplace, the need to have inclusive policies around maybe family leave or something like that? So can you actually speak to the issues knowledgeably? Have you done a little bit of work? Have you got some training in those things? And then have you developed the skills either through experience and through doing it, or because you're knowledgeable? So have you developed the skills in terms of knowing how to apply inclusive leadership in a workplace? So what does that mean? It might mean something like we'll do a policy audit and we'll make sure that all our policies have inclusive principles. What does that mean? That means that we're going to make sure that the language is inclusive. We're going to make sure that we're not discriminating between mothers and fathers for parental leave. So what does your parental leave policy look like? It could mean, how are you doing your hiring? Are you ensuring that your job descriptions, your position descriptions are inclusively written? What does that mean? That means that you look at the language, because the language can be very impactful in terms of who sees themselves reflected in, like, I can do that job or not. So there was one CEO that I knew a few years back who ran one of the biggest transportation companies in this country. So ran the Via Train company organization. So big, national, huge company. And his one of the things he did, and he is an old white guy, one of the things he did was require his VPs or his head of HR or whatever to bring gender balanced lists of shortlisted people to him, and if they for a position, and if somebody came in and gave him a list of people that had been shortlisted for a position, and it wasn't equitable, it wasn't balanced, he would send it back. And that was the CEO of the company. Send it back and go look for more really good people. And then he would really hold people accountable and have very high expectations of what people needed to do to promote gender equity. And so those are the kinds of things that contribute to inclusive leadership. It is being a leader and having these core competencies that you can apply and put into practice. And I think that's not as well understood as it needs to be. There's this assumption that because you're a woman in science or a woman in medicine, you're automatically an expert. That's not the case. I mean, we all have the responsibility to develop these skills and to really know what they mean and know how to apply them. So that's what I think of. I'm a big fan of the core competency way of thinking about gender equity and inclusive cultures and inclusive organizations.
Okay, Dr. Ko. Now, if we analyze and if we consider, for example, business and industries as complex, how important is gender equality? Or in other terms, in other words, how is gender equality considered, especially for achieving organizational change?
Well, I think it varies hugely depending on the sector. So some industries are better than others. I think it varies hugely where you are and what the history of your industry is. I think I would have assumed by now that there is sufficient evidence and research that supports the fact that if you move towards gender equity in a business or industry setting, the bottom line improves. You make more money. So to me, it seems that there's a very obvious driver there for most business and industry to really push towards gender equity. There's also a fair amount of research that says gender equity is good for men in various organizations. It creates more healthy workplaces for men, and it creates better governance systems. There's less corruption. There's less disruption. So I think there are very strong sort of business rationales for moving towards gender equity, but obviously it's going to involve changing the way we've done things, and it's going to involve some people maybe being threatened and feeling defensive, and it's going to mean that people are going to have to confront stereotypes and that kind of thing. So I think there's these two sort of things that challenge each other. One of them is it's good for business, and the CEO of the train company I described previously, he said, when he came on board and he brought in these policies, their profit increased by 5% a year. So the company was actually making more money as he was introducing these policies. Correlation. But I think there's enough evidence to say it seems like it should be something we would all want to be doing in business and industry. But obviously, any cultural change is disruptive and challenging. And so there's that human part which needs to be managed and can sometimes be very difficult. So yes, we want to go in that direction, but we also want to think about, it's hard because we're not used to it, and it challenges the way we're used to thinking and the way some people see themselves and systems of power and privilege, and that's always going to be disruptive.
For this question, do we have any example for sectors or industries where we have more advancements or perhaps more weakness in terms of gender equality? I don't know.
So we have So we've seen shifts in some aspects of science and medicine, some disciplines. We went in computer science, we went from being a very female heavy discipline in the 60s and 70s to a huge crash of women participating in the 80s, which has been correlated to the rise of the PC and marketing that as toys for boys and a culture around the bro tech culture. And so computer science went from being a very feminized profession and pathway to being a very masculinized pathway. When we look at medicine, in many places now we see gender equity in terms of male and female students in going into medicine. In some places, more women going into medicine, but where we don't see them increasing is in leadership positions. So if you look at a profession like pediatrics, interestingly, so this is American data. Interestingly, vast majority of pediatricians, doctors for children, are women. So very high proportion. But then if you look, who is the chair of pediatrics? Who is the dean? Who is the senior leader? Disproportionately male. So it's interesting that there is a very sort of heavily skewed female contingent in the profession, but it doesn't translate into leadership positions. So we can ask questions about, what's going on there. And we can look at shifts to your question. We can look at shifts in proportions. But then if we kind of cut the data another way, we can see that those shifts are not actually translating to other aspects of that profession or that organization. And so that's a area of interest. I think we want to be asking some questions about what's going on there and why is that happening.
Continue with your published paper. You mentioned that perhaps academic societies can play in advocating gender equality. So in your paper, basically you use the term allyship. You expand upon what it means and how to put this concept into practice?
Allyship? Is that what you said? Allyship.
Yes.
So allyship is allyship can be applied in many different settings, not just around gender. It can certainly be applied in supporting colleagues who've come from different backgrounds. So anti-racist activities, people who look like me, we need to make sure we're being really active allies, advocates, activists, to ensure that we support our Black scholars and doctors and physicians. So allyship is really that activity, and allyship is actionable. So allyship means doing something, not just saying I'm an ally. I see quite a lot of this. I'm an ally. You're not an ally unless the community tells you you're one, unless you're actually doing something. But allyship means stepping up to support the activities towards gender equity. Support, if you're an ally for gender equity, then as a man, you step up and support, you speak to the issues, you learn, you do a lot of learning, you educate yourself on the issues, and you look for opportunities to advance that agenda as an ally. So I think there are many ways to be an ally. A colleague of mine in the UK describes allyship as just being a decent human being. It's like, can we just be decent human beings? That's actually being an ally. It's, making sure that policies are followed, making sure that you call out bad behavior. This is one of the things that I think men could do a lot more, is actually call out bad behavior and commentary, especially when there isn't a woman in the room, because we know what happens behind closed doors is different from sometimes what happens out in public. So I think allyship is the action towards the support for a particular agenda to achieve a goal. It might not be in your direct self-interest, but ultimately it's in the interest of the collective.
And this term of allyship is related with the role of academic society, of, for example, the university or any research institution.
Yeah, allyship can be at the individual level, or it could be at the organizational level. So you can be, as an individual, you can be an ally. As a group, you can be an ally. I think science societies because they sort of cut across institutions, and because you can be a member of a science society that is global or national or, Pan-American, it is your colleagues in your network that you build around your discipline or your area of expertise. So so you already have a shared interest. I think you already have you're a part of a shared enterprise. And so there's already a collective there, and an opportunity to kind of work together on an agenda. I think science societies also have a little bit of independence maybe from institutional structures. So universities are very medieval in many ways. They're very, very sort of autocratic and bureaucratic. I don't know what your universities are like, but our universities are certainly medieval in many ways. And so science societies maybe have a little bit more independence. And I think as the former president of a science society, I could kind of unilaterally go in and say, we're going to revamp all of our awards, and we're going to infuse them with with all kinds of equity. So our awards processes for our society were very archaic, very opaque, not based on, we didn't give out awards based on clear, transparent rubrics. A lot of, so-and-so is a good friend of mine and a good guy, let's give this person an award. So I went in there and sort of said, I'm going to clean this up and going to make it transparent. We're going to have set criteria. I'll draft them. I'll write them up. I'll bring them to the board. We'll vote on them and that kind of thing. So there was an opportunity there to do, exactly that inclusive leadership, which was bring those principles and apply them, put them into action, and then run it. And some people didn't like that very much, but the collective, we had decided this is what we needed to do, and they agreed. And so that's what we did. And interestingly, the types of people getting awards shifted somewhat. What didn't look like it had for the last over 50 years. So I think for scientists and people in medicine and engineering, I think their societies can be quite influential in creating inclusive cultures with strong leadership and action. Universities are hard work. Universities are hard to get them to shift culture because they're medieval and they're very, set in their ways. So science societies, you can maybe get things done a little faster, maybe.
Great answer. Perhaps one of the most controversial topics when we talk about gender equality is imposing quotas, right? So in this sense, what are your views regarding imposing quotas in organizations as means to achieve gender equality? And perhaps would doing so treat candidates fairly?
Well, that's a great question. I love the question about quotas because it's a question that people have strong feelings about. And so I'm a big fan of quotas. And part of the reason I'm a fan of quotas is because it really provokes people to think. So I think quotas can be a useful tool. And I always say to people, think about what we've been doing for a couple of 100 years or however many years. There have been quotas all along. Right? There have been unspoken, unwritten quotas. So we know because there's bias in the system and because there's stereotypes and because there's exclusionary behavior and because the policies have been, not well written and because there hasn't been transparency, that there have been quotas and we know who's benefited from those quotas. It's just that we didn't say it out loud or it wasn't written down somewhere, but we know because we can look at the outcomes and we can look at who is in positions like politics. So we can, that is not balanced, right? That doesn't look like the community. It doesn't look like the population. So how do we get there? Well, we've kind of had these unwritten quotas. So let's start from an understanding of that's where we're at right now. Does that mean that we automatically have the best people in those positions? No, of course it doesn't, because we couldn't, because we haven't had equitable processes. So that means we've got people in those positions, people in those roles, whatever sector we're looking at, who maybe some of them are there on the basis of merit, but some of them are there on the basis of being part of the quota. the old white guys or whatever. So, and that means that maybe they're not the best people. So what we've got then, what we're starting from is an unwritten, unspoken quota that has a certain amount of mediocrity in it, certain amount of not meritorious people in it. And so if we're going to then say, I think we better apply, how about we apply quotas to rebalance, then what we're actually doing is, we'll hang on to the people who are there really for merit, but we're going to bring in people who are meritorious. And we're going to do that by ensuring that our processes are absolutely transparent and highly rigorous and really clear. And what's going to happen is quotas are going to displace some of those individuals who probably shouldn't be there. There's a very interesting paper that came out of Sweden a few years ago that kind of did the analysis on this and said nobody, and the conclusion was nobody should be afraid of quotas because quotas actually displace mediocre men. Now, you can imagine that that was quite controversial and that not everybody liked the result of that. But I think that's an interesting thing to think about, is that we can set quotas because we're actually trying to raise the bar and improve the whole kind of collective of what we've got in whatever sector we're talking about. And quotas can be used in that way. Does that make sense?
Interesting point on written quotas. Dr. Martin, I don't know if you have any general comment or perhaps any final question that you want to ask Dr. Cole.
Yeah, sure. See, I think that she hit the nail when she said that this inclusive leadership at the end of the day is good for business. I mean, if you think about it, you open to 50% of the population, so you have potential geniuses there, right? So why not use them? So I agree on that. So I agree that the market will give you an award, like higher reward, if you open up to that. So, I believe on the market, on the free market. So I do have some issues with quotas because I am against any type of enforcement or regulation by the government. Because at the end, I think that, you should let people do what they think is good for them. If it's not good for them, then the market will punish them. So other than quotas, do you think that the government should try to follow any other sort of regulation or enforcement?
So that's an interesting question. I think there's a role for government in incentivizing behaviors that are that promote gender equity, for sure. I think the government's job is to, act in the best interests of the society, and ensure that there is health and wealth for everybody. And that means that we need to pay attention to people who are underrepresented and maybe don't have a voice and aren't actually being, there isn't attention to them in medicine or science or whatever. And that we have a lot of evidence to say if you don't have women as part of teams or you don't have women involved in science, then you're missing out on some really important medicine and some really important information and knowledge, which affects women, right? So you want healthy societies, you want to make sure women are involved in those activities. So there can be incentivization, I think, that governments can have in different ways, in different programs, how they send research money, how they distribute funding for universities, that kind of thing, can kind of incentivize. Regulation can be tricky, or legislation can be tricky. Do you want to make it law? That's a very powerful tool. So in Canada, we legislated same-sex marriage. So one day it wasn't actually something that was officially recognized. And then as of another day, the next day, it was officially recognized. And you could not say that it wasn't allowed. So legislation can be a very powerful tool in affecting social change. But I don't think it can be used lightly. So I prefer the incentivization and the education approach. Having said that, sometimes that's not enough. and sometimes there needs to be a stronger push, in which case maybe you do need some regulation. But I don't, the challenge is finding that balance between government imposed actions and massive backlash and unintended consequences, and finding that balance, I think, can be tricky, which is why we all need to be part of the conversation, and it needs to be really clear why we're doing that. So while I'm a big fan of quotas, because I think it does displace mediocrity, the legislation regulation piece, I think, has to be much more nuanced, and there needs to be a lot of conversation about what the intent there is. So
thank you very much, Dr. Cole, Dr. Martin. The time for this interview was really short. We have many further questions. We really appreciate all of your comments and significant contributions. Finally, in order to finish the conversation in this session, discussing some concerns about organizational best practices towards gender equality in science and medicine, policies and changes and challenges also. Now we go to our institutional announcement, and then we'll continue with our program. Again, Dr. Cole, thank you very much. We kindly invite you for another conversation, again, for a near future.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Very best wishes.
Thank you.